My name is Gabor. I'm a medical doctor, retired from clinical work because I'm too busy traveling and speaking on the subjects that are dear to my heart. And I've explored addictions, mental health, childhood development, trauma, stress and health. And in the last few years, I should say, for about 8 years, I've been working with ayahuasca as a healing modality in treatment of addictions, depression, and also in the healing of various physical ailments as well. So my work covers a broad range, all of which have to do with helping people heal.
And so, what led to your interest in exploring ayahuasca as an avenue for healing?
When my most recent book on addiction was published, I began to receive a lot of inquiries about what I knew about addiction and the use of ayahuasca and the healing of addiction, and I knew nothing until I was almost tired of the questions. I kept thinking, I just written a book, ask me what I know about, don't ask me what I don't know about. But then I had an opportunity to participate in the ceremony. And at the very first ceremony, I understood why people were asking me. My own experience with the plant was such that I got why it would help people with any number of issues, including addictions. In that first experience of the plant, I understood why people would see it as a potential ally in the healing of addictions or of any other issues that have to do with emotional pain and trauma. And I could see how people get in touch with their pain that they've been trying to escape from, but also with a deeper self underneath the pain, a self that is in contact with love and clarity and wisdom that doesn't have to run. So the plant experience has the potential of helping people understand their experience and their deeper selves in a way that's otherwise hard to, not impossible, but hard to get to.
And so, that being said, do you think that there's a reason for someone to use ayahuasca for healing, even if they don't have a significant issue, like addiction, for example?
The plant ayahuasca is not specific to any one particular human condition. It's not like it's a treatment for addiction, or it's a treatment for depression or cancer or anything else. What it is a way to get to know yourself more deeply. So anyone who wants to get to know themselves more deeply can consider it as a possible pathway. It's not necessary, and it's not for everyone, and it's not the only way, but it is a way, and it's a very powerful one. And the experience of not knowing ourselves, of being distant from ourselves, which is really the essence of trauma, is very, very common. And that can show up in many, many, many ways. It can show up as anxiety, as depression. It can show up as physical disease. It can show up as addiction. It can just show up as a discomfort with the self, confusion about life. But they all represent a separation, a distancing, a not knowing of the self. And given that the plant is a pathway to learning, to get to know yourself, to connecting with yourself, therefore it can help you in a whole range of conditions. Or for anyone who doesn't have a diagnosable condition, but just isn't totally comfortable with themselves or confident that they know themselves.
And your own personal experience with ayahuasca, after that or during that, did you find that you had any kind of paradigm shift in regards to yourself personally or professionally in your academic work?
The greater shift for me occurred professionally, in that I found a modality with the help of which I can get people to understand themselves and see new possibilities for themselves in a period of 7 to 8 days over 3 ceremonies, much more rapidly than I could over years of talking with them. And so I do that. And although it's only a small part of my overall work, it's also the most exciting part because the transformations are so dramatic. Having said that, there's no panacea, and this isn't the panacea either, because the realizations now need to be applied in real life. The realizations have to be made real. They have to be integrated and incorporated. And that's, given the nature of our culture and given people's ingrained tendencies, is always a challenge. But it's an opening that happens that is otherwise hard to attain.
Years ago, you ran a study working with a Shipibo Ayahuasquero, helping people overcome addiction, I think specifically in Coast Salish First Nations communities. Would you be able to tell me a bit about that study?
Okay, I didn't run the study. We were asked to come to a First Nations community in British Columbia, which, as all First Nations communities, virtually is heavily beset by addictions and depression and other mental health issues, which is a direct outcome of the severe multi-generational trauma that is now being recognized as a huge trauma on our indigenous people. So this is a highly traumatized population. And given that addiction is a response to trauma, and a population that's also heavily addicted. So we were asked to come there and do our work with the plant and the Shipibo tradition. Other people wanted to do a study of it, so they did an observational study, and that study has been published. And what was shown is that even after just a few ceremonies over a very short period of time, there were very promising outcomes in terms of people's attitudes and substance use and so on. Now, the work would have to go on much longer to be really successful over a longer period of time, and that same community has asked for that healing to be repeated, and it has happened, sometimes with a Aboriginal Shipibo healer from Peru, and sometimes with people trained in that tradition, but not necessarily Peruvians themselves. So that work has continued in fits and starts with that particular community, and they found it very positive. But really, for it to be fully effective and properly studied, it would have to go on over time, and in an environment where it's done illicitly, really, our possibilities of exploring it to its full extent are very limited.
Can you talk a little more about why that is?
Well, ayahuasca is illegal in Canada as it is in the United States. Now, Health Canada, which is the regulatory agency, has acknowledged that it's neither harmful nor addictive. But for technical reasons, because it contains products, albeit in small quantities, that are themselves illegal, therefore ayahuasca is illegal. Again, despite the fact that they acknowledge its benign nature and non-addictive nature. So it's an utterly irrational, bureaucratic, technical regulation that stands in the way of a lot more people receiving help from a modality that could really, really, really make a difference for them. Now, the other limitation, of course, is that people should not be using the plant without the proper setting. And that means under the guidance of people who've trained in the tradition, ceremonially trained and capable of providing the guidance and the leadership. And also of people who can help the participants prepare for their experience and then understand and integrate their experience afterwards. So there's a very limited number of such people around. So even if it was legal, I would not want to see mass use of it unless those conditions were met, and that would take a long time. But then at least we could openly train people and have venues, and people wouldn't have to travel out of the country or do it illicitly in this country, which is what they do.
That being said, what place, what level, what extent do you think that indigenous medicinal practices like the Shipibo tradition of ayahuasca have in our Western culture? Which is because it is. I've talked to a lot of people that say, it's cultural appropriation to be using it. That's one tradition that was one group looked to before when they were cut off from Western medicine, which is obviously in our culture seen as the trump card. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as a Western trained medical doctor and who was in practice for over 3 decades, I can tell you both about the miraculous achievements of Western medicine and also about its limitations. So the achievements we don't have to address, they're amazing. The limitations, however, are immense. And when it comes to chronic conditions of mind and body, Western medicine is largely helpless. We can mitigate, alleviate symptoms, but that's about all we can do. We don't know how to help people heal. The traditional medicinal practices, not just in the Amazon basin, but in North America and elsewhere, are actually better at evoking people's inner healing capacities. So they provide something that Western medicine doesn't. I would love to see less arrogance on our part as kind of Northerners and Westerners about how great we are and how great our science is, and more humility about understanding what we don't understand, accepting that there's a lot of things we don't understand that our particular perspective just doesn't encompass or can account for. So I've learned a lot from my limited exposure to traditional medicinal practices. Number one. Number two is when it comes to cultural appropriation, it's not a debate that I'm much interested in. If it works and if we can use it, for God's sakes, they don't belong to anybody. They're just what some human beings learned at a certain place in time. And so Western science has learned some things, and blessedly, that knowledge can be transmitted around the world and used to help and heal or at least cure and a lot of people and prevent a lot of disease. It's not cultural appropriation, it's just the spread of knowledge and information. And I see the same thing when we up here learn about native practices elsewhere, as long as we do so with humility and respect. And I've actually had ayahuasqueros tell me from Peru that they don't perceive appropriation. They perceive that the medicine is traveling north because the north needs the help. So it'd be appropriation if I took it and I pretended I created it and I took credit for it and ignored the sources and didn't respect the people really who helped to create this knowledge. That would be appropriation, but that's not what I'm advocating, nor do I know anybody who's advocating that.
I watched an interview with you in 2013, I think it was, on your work with ayahuasca, and you were able to speak to a lot of the issues that were starting to be resolved with people working with medicine. You brought up the Santa Daime tradition in Brazil as a place where people go and practice, but you said that when someone asked about specific scientific evidence, you said you couldn't really offer anything to that because it just didn't exist yet. Years later, is that changing? Has that changed? How would you answer that question now?
I would say that on my computer I've collected dozens of studies now to do with plant healing and to do with ayahuasca, that although it's difficult to do such research in the context of what we call the West, by which I mean Europe and North America, because of the legal restrictions, there has been some very interesting research done in Latin America, which are all point in a positive direction. in terms of the positive effects on the brain, diminished mental illness, diminished depression, diminished drug use, and so on. We have also done some interesting research in the West now from the perspective of what does the plant do in the brain and which brain circuits are involved. And they seem to have to do with circuits that have to do with childhood emotions and to do with insight. So imagine if you could revisit your childhood emotional experiences with the insight of an adult. So there's been some intriguing research on the brain and some very positive clinical research on outcomes, which I could now point to. But I don't have to, because I already know, because I've seen it. So as far as I'm concerned, research is always interesting to convince people that are skeptical, and therefore it's useful to do, but I don't need research. If I see something that works, it works.
So with that being said, when we're talking about the possible importance of adopting a tradition like ayahuasca into a Western medicinal practice, my experience, not everyone's, but I know a lot of people's experience with ayahuasca have been largely spiritual in nature. Mm-hmm. How do you think that spiritual aspect of the practice can reconcile with the scientific method?
Well, first of all, what do you mean by spiritual?
I mean, like, for example, a shaman, if you talk to a shaman or an Ayahuasquero, they'll tell you how they can, really be sensitive of like to someone's energy. That's all their thoughts and things like that. That to someone who's a very
what's spiritual about that?
That's a very question. I think spiritual in a way that things that that sort of a closed-minded person would say that's not possible. Like a person can't sit here and be able to sense something across the room and know what that person's thinking and have any kind of physical effect on them. Whereas I've seen like that's definitely something that happens.
All right. Okay, now I got it. So, from the scientific perspective, the Western medical view of disease is not scientific. Because the Western medical view separates the mind from the body, the emotions from the physiology, and it separates the individual from the environment. Whereas, and I've written books on this, there's been elegant and voluminous research on this. In fact, in the living body itself, there's no possible separation between our emotions, our nervous systems, our cardiovascular apparatus, our heart, our blood vessels, our immune system, and our gut, and our hormonal apparatus. So whether we're looking at hormones or emotions or nervous system activity or immune system activity or cardiovascular activity or activity of our gut, we're looking at the functioning of a indivisible unit. And there are many pathways between those connections are established, but the point is, it's just one unit with different parts of it or different aspects of it, all correlated. It's unscientific to look at health and disease in any other way. In other words, Western medical practice is unscientific, where there's a very narrow window on the science, despite the research, which is not even controversial. So the activity of a brain center, the amygdala, which deals with stress and fear, actually has an impact on the potential for heart disease because of its effect on the bone marrow and the blood vessels. Just to give one small example. Mm-hmm. That also means that any modality that effectively and deeply engages people's emotional states, particularly the hidden, repressed emotional states that are the result of childhood trauma, will naturally have a potential impact on that person's physiology. So it's pure science to say that working deeply with people's emotions and emotional histories can and will have a profound physiological effect. It's not a spiritual question. It's a straight physiological question. Now, when I lead retreats with the plant, I lead about 25 people, and during the day, I lead a circle in which we find out why people are there, what were the historical events in their lives, and what are the emotional resonances that they carry or where they're blocked. So I'll have a certain view of them, a certain take on them, and we help them formulate an intention for the ceremony. After a day and a half of that, they go into ceremony at night. I don't lead the ceremonies. I'm not an ayahuasquero. The ceremony is led by people who are trained in the Shipibo tradition. It's in the dark. My ayahuasquero colleagues, in order to work with people, have to read their energies. They do so in the dark. And they direct their chants at specific people at specific times in response to what energetic resonance they pick up on. Now, here's what's astonishing, both astonishing and not, and it's absolutely universal, that whatever I picked up about people when I was working with them through words, and I'm seeing their body language and I'm listening to the tone of their voice, my ayahuasca friends will pick up the same things in the dark when the client is not saying anything at all, just based on reading their energies. So they're trained that way. So I find it always very interesting and affirming and astonishing, but not really surprising. Because why wouldn't they? People do have energies that other people, and you don't have to be a trained person. You can sit with somebody in a room and just tell that they're carrying a lot of anger, even if they don't know they're carrying a lot of anger. I mean, we've all had that experience. So imagine being trained to pick up people's energies. Why wouldn't you be able to do that? And again, whatever they find and work with is what I find I work with. They do it at night. I do it during the day. They do it with the client silent. I do it with the client talking. And we say the same thing. We see the same things. So we're all, the two possibilities. Either we're both seeing reality in different ways, or we're both, myself and my ayahuasca friends, totally insane, and therefore we're just having the same hallucination. Those are the two possibilities. Take your choice.
And I have had debates with people who, no matter sort of what I say or talk about the experience, the science behind it, no matter what it's that's just a chemical reaction in your brain. That's it. Like,
well,
what
yeah.
good can that be?
Well, so there is a tendency in the West to reduce people to biology and biochemistry. That's one way to look at human beings. I find it both as a person and as a clinician and as somebody who I believe understands something about the research, totally limiting and narrow and simplistic and reductionist. We're not just our brain chemistry. And our brain chemistry, I could change your brain chemistry in a second, by the way. I could, depending on how I talk to you in the next minute, what my tone of voice was, what my body language was. Your physiology would change. Your heart rate would change. Your hormone levels would change. I can change your chemistry. Does that mean that I can reduce your chemistry? No, the reason your chemistry would change is because the emotions have such an impact on our physiology. And our emotions are very much modulated by our interactions with other people. So the reality is that we are biopsychosocial creatures. Biopsychosocial. That means that our biology and our psychology is inseparable from our social relationships, and each one affects each of the others. And that's the only way to understand human beings.
Fascinating. So, what would you like to, or what do you think needs to change for our society and culture to get to a place that is more accepting and acknowledges your point of view? Or are they already, do you think?
Well, again, nothing what I'm saying is outside the can of Western science. It's all been studied. What's lacking is actually an openness to looking at the evidence. So never mind that we have an arrogance about traditional cultures and we dismiss their teachings as primitive or inferior to ours. We don't even look at our own science. I mean, most of my physicians' colleagues wouldn't know what the heck I was talking about. At least, that's not true. They might if they heard it, but they're not aware of this perspective. So that we're trained in a very, very narrow way. We live in a materialistic society, which means that we don't like to look at the larger picture. And the same thing is true in medicine. So there's just a resistance. And of course, if, for example, physicians or lawyers and judges or policymakers or educators understood the implications of this biopsychosocial view, a whole lot of things would have to change. How we practice medicine would have to radically change. How we educated kids would have to radically change. What kind of parenting advice we would give to young mothers and fathers would have to change. What kind of social policies we would enact and pursue would have to change. And there's tremendous conservatism and resistance to change. So whether this perspective is accepted has not to do with its merits. It has to do with the challenge that it poses to the way things are. And you know how difficult it is for people, say you and I, when we have a certain idea about something and somebody says, well, hey, you know, there's a totally different way of looking at it. It's not always easy to embrace that, especially if we're emotionally invested in our point of view.
Do you see that's the way we're going, though, culturally?
Well, I think there's a huge breakdown happening in Western culture now. I mean, we see that. I mean, for God's sakes, we're destroying the earth. I mean, only the President of the United States anymore denies that there's climate change, you know, and certain people around him. I mean, in other words, things are not working. And that's just one example. And if you look at the epidemic of overdoses in the States and Canada in this year of 2017, if you look at the many people diagnosed with mental health disorders, the many more children being medicated, I mean, there's every reason to question the health of this culture. So as this breakdown becomes more apparent, there's also naturally more of a desire to find out what's going on and to look for alternative ways of understanding ourselves. So I'm seeing both. I'm seeing both a tremendous crisis and a situation where things are actually getting worse. But that is also inducing or triggering tremendous curiosity and interest and people wanting new ways of understanding their experience. So there's a dialectic between, Karl Marx said that any society will eventually create its own, the contradictions will sharpen, and then the contradictions are sharpening now. Which also means more people are waking up.
And what do you, in your viewpoint, like you hear that a lot, like people waking up. Like, what does that mean to you, that phrase?
Well, what's the difference between your sleep and when you're awake? When you're asleep, you're dreaming. You're seeing images that your mind has created, but you're not seeing reality. Because the images your mind is seeing don't actually exist, except in your mind. Now, we go through life like that because the way our psychology is, how should I say it, created and programmed early in childhood, we have great difficulty seeing reality. We have certain experiences that give us a certain point of view. And like the Buddha said, with our thoughts, we create the world. It's our thoughts that create the world that we live in. But what kind of thoughts? Those thoughts are based on a certain kind of experience of, say, a hurt child. Then we go see, then we go through reality, seeing reality through the eyes of a hurt child. And that can result in either denying reality, because it's too painful, and then you become president and deny climate change. Or it will be that we will have to see things as more rosy than they are, because there's more lovely than they are, because we can't stand the pain of what really is. Or we see everything through pain only, and we don't see how lovely things are. But in any of these cases, we're not seeing reality, we're seeing a creation of our minds. And that's what it means to be asleep. So to wake up is just to see how things actually are. What is actually the case? And what is actually the case with me? And what is the case with you? That's what it means to wake up. It's just seeing how it is.
And do you think ayahuasca is a sort of a crucial part of helping someone wake up, have that perspective?
Well, ayahuasca can help people wake up. It can certainly help people wake up by opening the third eye, or simply by putting them in touch with realities that they had repressed, or putting them in touch with an aspect of themselves that they had lost contact with. It can help people wake up. Again, the guidance is essential and the setting is essential. Because the mind can use ayahuasca too for its own purposes. It's quite possible for somebody to have an ayahuasca experience and come out of it believing in a lot of fantasies, either negative or positive. It depends on who's guiding it and who's keeping them real.
You mentioned the third eye. From a more scientific standpoint, would you mind elaborating on what you mean?
I don't have a scientific
answer. Or in general, I'm just interested because, you know, as a physician, I would be surprised. I haven't really spoken to anyone that really, because it's not really something that a lot of people sort of believe in or really talk about.
Jesus says something where he says that if your eye be single, then you see reality clearly. What is he talking about? Like, we have two eyes. Talking eye be single. I think he's talking about the third eye. And what is that? I don't think there's a third eye. I mean, anatomically, you're never going to find it. So it's the metaphor, at least, for an experience or for a certain way of looking at things. And that's when you see all of reality as unitary. Like, rather than bringing in stereoscopic vision from two different eyes and then trying to correlate them in the brain, I am told, and I've read, and I believe, intuit, that there's a unitary way of looking at things, where you just see all of reality as one. And that, of course, scientifically makes total sense, because it is all one. I mean, you and I are nothing but molecules and a certain set of substances organized in a certain form, very temporarily. Other than that, we're just part of the whole thing. And if somebody just read energies, if there was some device out there that picked up purely energies, we would just be fluctuating and mobile agglomerations of energy that have come together for a while, go through a period of growth, go through another period of shrinkage, and then just dissolve back into the whole thing again. So it is all one. And people have had perceptions of that oneness, and that's what they mean by the third eye. I'm not sitting here as somebody who's had that experience where I can speak credibly about it, but at the same time, something in me says, yeah, that's how it is.
Then last question, just a weird one, but just say we lived in a place where ayahuasca was very widely accepted, and maybe not everyone, but most people did it as a part of a health regime, whatever. How do you think our society would be different?
if the question is, how would our society be different if I was more accepted, I want to turn that question around. What would a society be like that accepted ayahuasca? In other words, what would have to happen? We'd have to be more open-minded. We'd have to be less arrogant. We'd have to accept that we need help. We need to accept that the sources of many of our problems emanate from the inside. Not that it's our fault, but it is our responsibility. That much of what makes us tick as human beings is unconscious to us. We don't know ourselves very well. And that if we did, we'd be liberated. Well, imagine if we had a society that had that kind of wisdom. So, of course, if more people had the ayahuasca experience, there'd be more people like that around too. But it works both ways. So not just what would ayahuasca do to our society, but also what kind of society would be open to it in the first place. And of course, we're getting many people who are more and more open to it for all the reasons that we talked about.
And out of curiosity, have you personally worked with or know about other researchers who are working with other plant medicines?
For sure. Well, more broadly speaking, I know people who are working with psychedelic medicines, some of which are plant medicines and some of which are not. So there's been research on psilocybin mushrooms on end-of-life anxiety at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, I think, and at UCLA. The results are very positive. People have spiritual experiences that make them much more at ease with their lives and their impending deaths as a result. There have been studies, large-scale studies, about to go even larger scale with MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder. So people who receive psychotherapy under the impact of MDMA, they do much better than with other forms of therapy for MDMA, for PTSD. These studies are going to third phase now, which means they've been approved, government approved, gone through preliminary phases, shown success, shown no negative side effects, and now they're going to a large scale to see over time to demonstrate their impact. There's a substance called ibogaine, which is an extract of an African plant called iboga, that is quite powerful in healing opiate addictions. So you can take ibogaine and you don't have to go through withdrawal from opiates. And I've seen that personally. Now again, it has to be used by the right people in the right circumstances. But there's a plant that is not illegal in Canada that can actually help opiate addicts. And again, until a few years ago, I knew nothing about it, despite the fact that I spent all those years in addiction medicine. So there's a tremendous interest now in alternative ways of healing, psychedelic ways of healing, including the plants, such as mushrooms, such as ayahuasca, such as peyote, such as iboga.
And do you, I'm curious if you see what differences of effectiveness or however do you see between plant psychedelics and like chemically made psychedelics? Is there a difference? I've met people with very conflicting opinions on it. What's yours? Like LSD as opposed to ayahuasca or straight DMT?
Well, I have not done any comparison. I've not worked with LSD in a therapeutic setting. It certainly has possibilities as far as I can best tell. In fact, I know that it can. I wouldn't know how to compare the two, except for my personal acquaintance with the different substances. They feel very different to me. The ayahuasca is very much there's a presence there that you don't get with the LSD. Um, there's a sense of engaging with something that you don't get with the LSD. Um, but I don't want to say too much because I haven't studied it. I don't think there's been fair comparisons. And ultimately, why even compare? People will do what they are drawn to do, what they are called to do. A lot of people these days are being called to work with the ayahuasca plant. It's amazing. Since I first found out about 8 years ago, I don't go anywhere now without somebody knowing about it, a lot of people knowing about it. Maybe over time we'll see some differences emerge between the man-made chemicals and the ayahuascaros will already tell you that there's differences. They'll say that the plant has a spirit, whereas the chemical does not. But that's not language that I easily understand.
How would you describe that presence that you speak of then? What is that in your mind?
Well, I mean, my last ex, I don't always get that sense. I'm rather resistant to ayahuasca, actually. I work beautifully with it to help others, but I'm less amenable to its magic myself, it seems, for whatever reason. But a whole number of times, and including the last time I worked with it, I did have the sense of somebody teaching me something or showing me something. Not of just me having a vision or an experience, but of some guidance to that experience. That's what I mean by the presence. Now, some people will actually have this mother image talking to them. Well, they'll have entities appear. I've never had entities. I've never had those images. And it doesn't matter. Everybody's got their own experience. But the sense of presence, that I can attest to.
And what are your thoughts on, when you talk about people's experience, everyone's experience is so different. Like, it's not like Western medicine, for example, where you take a pill and another person takes a pill and you have a very similar reaction. Ayahuasca, it's very hard to find parallel experiences between people who use it. Can you speak a little bit?
Well, not only do different people have different experiences, the same person will have different experiences every time they do it. So, which is not surprising, because it's not that the ayahuasca does something specific to you. What the ayahuasca does is it opens up something inside you. But what will emerge is whatever happens to be inside you. So why should the same thing emerge for you as for me? And why should the same thing emerge for you 2 separate days? Because even after one experience, you're not the same person going to the second experience as you were going to the first experience. So the fact that we should all have different experiences, given the great variability of our neurological apparatus and our brain chemistry and our emotional histories and personalities and cultural expectations and all that, why should we all have the same experience? And why should the same person even imagine they'll have the same experience on different occasions?